A young philosophy student named Wilhelm Hartmann recorded in a personal notebook during the spring of 1913 a series of private conversations he had with Rudolf Steiner in a small cafe in Vienna, where they met weekly to discuss issues that Wilhelm did not dare raise in public lectures for fear of appearing naive in front of more experienced members of the Anthroposophical Society. During one of these conversations, Wilhelm had directly asked how it was possible that Akashic records could preserve everything that had happened since the beginning of the universe without the etheric substance that contained them becoming infinitely heavy or too complex to be accessible. Steiner had smiled and responded that the question revealed exactly the kind of materialistic thinking that needed to be transcended to truly understand the nature of cosmic memory. Akashic records did not function like physical libraries, where each book took up space and where adding new volumes would eventually exhaust available shelves. They operated according to completely different principles, where time and space were not limitations, but were dimensions that could be navigated in multiple directions simultaneously. Each event that occurred was not stored as a separate object, but was integrated into a living totality that was the consciousness of spiritual beings that Steiner identified as Lipikas, or lords of karma, whose entire existence consisted of witnessing and preserving experiences of evolutions. For these beings, there was no distinction between remembering and being because their identities were made up of the memories they maintained. When they accessed records, they were not retrieving archived information, but were literally reliving events through consciousness that they had originally witnessed. This meant that the past was not dead or fixed, but remained alive in dimensions where Lipikas existed awaiting reconnections with incarnated consciousnesses that developed appropriate attunement capabilities. Perhaps the strangest thing about the Akashic records is that the more you hear about them, the more it seems to tap into something you've felt before, but never been able to explain. Rudolf Steiner said that certain knowledge is not learned in the common way. They are recognized. And maybe that's exactly the feeling that's happening now. If you want to continue exploring this without interrupting this train of thought, the next step is in the description link and pinned comment. Wilhelm had noted that this explanation left him even more confused because it seemed to suggest that the past could change depending on how it was remembered, which contradicted basic notions of causality that modern philosophy assumed to be the foundations of objective reality. Steiner did not disagree, but explained that linear causality of past determining present and present determining future was true only at denser levels of physical existence where time flowed in a single direction. In dimensions where Akashic records existed, causality was circular or rather spherical, where futures influenced pasts as much as pasts influenced futures through loops of meaning that were woven through all temporal dimensions simultaneously. When a person transformed consciousness in the present through spiritual developments, they not only changed how they interpreted the past, but literally changed the nature of past events in the context of the totality of their evolutionary journeys. Childhood trauma that had been experienced as victimization when it occurred could be retroactively transformed into precious initiation when viewed from a mature perspective that recognized which soul had chosen experience for specific developments. This transformation was not merely psychological, but was ontological, changing what the event had actually been into the fabric of destiny. This was possible because Akashic records did not just preserve the raw facts of what had happened, but preserved meanings and purposes that events carried, and these meanings were fluidly changing as consciousnesses evolved, creating new understandings. The same war seen from the perspective of victims was a senseless tragedy, but seen from the perspective of souls planning incarnations before being born, it was a collective opportunity to learn through extreme suffering lessons about the consequences of hatred and separation that could not be learned in other ways. Both perspectives were true simultaneously on different levels of reality. Wilhelm had then asked how it was possible to know which perspective was truer, or whether they were all equally valid, leading to relativism, where nothing had objective meaning. Steiner had responded that a hierarchy of truths existed based on how complete and integrated perspectives were. Victim's view was partial because he only saw his own suffering without understanding larger contexts. Vision of soul planning incarnation was more complete because it encompassed not only present life, but multiple lives and evolutionary purposes. But even this perspective was not final, because there were even higher levels where Lipikas saw not only journeys of individual souls, but patterns of evolutions of entire humanity through the ages and beyond, that perspectives of higher angelic hierarchies that saw developments of entire solar systems, and eventually perspective of divinity that saw everything in absolute unity where separations between observer and observed dissolved completely. Spiritual path was progression through these levels of perspectives, each revealing deeper truths, without completely invalidating truths from previous levels, but contextualizing them into greater understandings. Conversation had now turned to the practical question of how exactly a person could develop the ability to access Akashic records. rather than just theoretically speculating about their natures. Steiner had explained that the first essential step was the development of what he called sense-free thinking or pure thinking, which was the ability to form concepts and follow logic without dependence on sensory images or memories of physical experiences. When most people thought about abstract concepts such as freedom or justice, they unconsciously visualized concrete examples or felt associated emotions. Pure thought required the discipline of maintaining attention on pure concepts without allowing imaginations or feelings to interfere. This was trained through specific meditations, where the person focused on simple objects, such as triangles or circles, trying to think about pure geometric shapes without visualizing specific triangles or circles drawn in particular colors or defined sizes. Eventually, through prolonged practice, the ability to think purely developed, allowing the mind to operate in conceptual dimensions that were gateways to perceptions of etheric dimensions where records existed. The second step was development of what Steiner called imagination, which was not arbitrary fantasy, but was direct perception of archetypal forms that existed in etheric dimensions underlying physical manifestations. While pure thought was active and controlled by will, true imagination was receptive, allowing images to arise spontaneously from higher dimensions, revealing structures of reality that were invisible to physical senses. Developments of imagination required years of meditations, where one learned to distinguish between products of one's own fantasy versus genuine perceptions of etheric realities. Crucial criteria were that genuine imaginations had qualities of objectivity where the same forms appeared consistently when investigated repeatedly, and where different trained clairvoyants saw the same structures when observing the same phenomena. Costumes, on the other hand, were inconsistent, changing capriciously and being unique to the individuals who created them. Steiner had warned that many spiritual aspirants confused fantasies with genuine perceptions, because they had not developed the rigorous discernment necessary for distinctions. Third step was development of inspiration, which was the ability not only to see archetypal forms, but to understand meanings and messages they carried. It was listening to languages from spiritual worlds that communicated not through words, but through direct impressions on consciousness that then had to be translated into human concepts and languages. True inspiration was accompanied by inner certainty that transcended doubts, because it was direct perception of truths, rather than inferences or speculations. Fourth and highest step was intuition, which was complete union between knower and known, where separations between subject and object dissolved, allowing one to literally become what one was knowing, by experiencing from within rather than observing from without. It was at this level of intuition that complete accesses to Akashic records were possible, because one was not merely reading about past events, but was entering into the consciousness of beings who had experienced events by temporarily becoming one with them by reliving experiences from their perspectives. Wilhelm had noted that progression through these 4 steps seemed to require decades of dedicated practice, and asked if there were shortcuts or accelerated methods. Steiner had firmly responded that there were no safe shortcuts, and that attempts to force premature developments through intensive techniques such as extreme breathing or the use of consciousness-altering substances were extremely dangerous and could cause permanent damage to subtle bodies that would take multiple incarnations to heal. Slow but sure path was unique, appropriate for modern times, where people needed to develop capabilities through conscious efforts, rather than inheriting them as natural gifts that ancient civilizations possessed, but which were unconscious and uncontrollable. He had also emphasized that developments of psychic abilities without parallel developments of moral virtues were recipes for disaster, because powers without wisdom and compassion were inevitably misused, creating terrible karmas. For this reason, true esoteric training always included cultivations of humility, truthfulness, courage, and love as foundations, without which abilities to access records were more curses than blessings, leading to illusions, spiritual pride, or even insanity. In another conversation weeks later, Wilhelm had asked about specific content that could be found in Akashic records, questioning whether everything was really preserved, including private thoughts and secret actions that people tried to hide. Steiner had confirmed that absolutely everything was preserved without exceptions, because in levels of reality where records existed, there was no possibility of secrets or deceptions. Every thought, every emotion, every action, no matter how trivial or how carefully concealed, left permanent impressions in etheric substance that were completely transparent to developed clairvoyant perceptions. This did not mean that Lepicus were moralizing judges condemning people for transgressions, because their function was to preserve and witness rather than judge. Judgments came through automatic operations of karmic laws that were natural laws, as impersonal as gravity, creating appropriate consequences for actions without the need for interventions from external authorities. When a person accessed records of their own past lives, they directly confronted all the choices they had made. seeing not just external actions, but complete motivations and consequences in chains of causation that extended across multiple lives. Not all knowledge attracts attention in the same way. Some just inform, others linger in your mind long after you hear them. If this happened to you now, access is in the description link and in the pinned comment. This confrontation was simultaneously humiliating and liberating. Humiliating because no illusion about kindness or self-justification could survive the clear vision of selfishness and cruelty that everyone had committed at some point in their journeys. Liberating because fully understanding why mistakes had been made and seeing ways in which they were being balanced and transcended removed paralyzing guilt and replaced it with determination to do better, equipped with the wisdom of experience. Wilhelm had then questioned privacy by asking if it meant that any clairvoyant could invade the thoughts and memories of others without permissions. Steiner had explained that natural protections existed where records of people were accessible only to those who had sufficient spiritual developments to honor the sacredness of information, and who had legitimate reasons based on evolutionary services rather than curiosities or desires for power over others. Lipikas functioned as guardians controlling access, based on qualities of seeker's consciousness. Attempts to access records for impure motivations were automatically blocked, or worse still, could result in illusions, where the person saw not realities but projections of their own prejudices and desires, thinking they were seeing truths when they were only seeing distorted reflections of their own psyche. Many who claimed to have read Akashic records were really just accessing their own imaginations without recognizing differences. Conversation had also explored the question of whether records contained only the past, or whether they also contained futures. Steiner had explained that records contained both, but in different forms. Past existed in records as events that had fully manifested on all levels of reality from causal to physical, creating fixed patterns that could not be undone, although meanings could be transformed as previously discussed. Future existed as multiplicities of possibilities in states of superpositions where different timelines coexisted awaiting choices that would determine which would manifest. Reading futures and records, therefore, was not seeing what would definitely happen, but was seeing ranges of possibilities with different probabilities based on current trends and accumulated karma. Some possibilities were highly probable based on the momentum of established patterns, while others were remote, requiring dramatic changes in consciousness or circumstances. But until the final moment, nothing was completely determined because free will always operated, allowing and unexpected choices created new futures that did not exist in possibilities until moments of decision. This explained why prophecies often failed, because they saw probable futures based on present conditions, but could not predict how free consciousnesses would change directions through choices that transcended patterns. True prophets did not proclaim fixed futures, but warned about probable consequences of current paths, offering opportunities for change that could avoid unwanted destinations through transformations of consciousness and actions. Wilhelm had also recorded conversations about more technical aspects of how records worked by asking about mechanisms through which events were imprinted in etheric substance. Steiner had explained that all physical matter was a manifestation of patterns in etheric dimensions, where vital forces organized substance into forms that then densified into physical objects. When events occurred on the physical plane, they were the results of processes that had begun in higher dimensions, descending through layers to final materializations. Each stage of these processes left impressions on substances of corresponding dimensions, creating records in multiple layers. Thoughts left stronger impressions in mental dimensions, emotions in astral dimensions, physical actions in etheric dimensions. Akashic records themselves existed in a higher dimension called the causal plane, or Akasha, which was the matrix from which all other dimensions emerged and to which they all eventually returned. Accessing records on a causal plane required development of intuition, which was a higher capacity, while records on lower dimensions could be accessed through imagination or inspiration, which were more easily developed. This explained why different clairvoyants could see different aspects of the same events depending on the levels of consciousness they had achieved. Clairvoyants, operating only on an astral level, saw emotions and atmospheres, but did not see underlying thoughts or deep karmic causes that only clairvoyants operating on causal levels perceived. Wilhelm also questioned the temporal extent of records, asking whether they preserved only Earth's history or whether they included developments of the entire cosmos throughout eternity. Steiner had responded that records that were accessible to human consciousness were primarily those related to evolutions of Earth and humanity, because they were relevant contexts for present developments. But beings of higher hierarchies had access to records of entire solar systems and galaxies, and eventually the entire cosmos in its entirety. There were also temporal limitations, where records of extremely remote pasts prior to certain transformations in reality structures were less accessible because they existed in forms that required capacities of consciousness that transcended normal human developments. Similarly, records of distant futures were nebulous because they depended on choices that had not yet been made by countless generations of free beings whose decisions could not be predicted with precision. In one of the last recorded conversations, Wilhelm had asked about the practical uses of developing the ability to read Akashic records, questioning whether they were just intellectual curiosities or whether they served concrete purposes. Steiner had explained that knowledge of records served multiple essential purposes. First, they allowed verification of spiritual teachings through direct investigation rather than reliance on traditions or authorities that might have been corrupted over centuries. Secondly, they provided understandings of individual karmas, revealing the origins of trends and challenges that people faced, allowing conscious work with destinies rather than merely being carried along by currents of unconscious causation. Third, they revealed patterns of collective evolution, showing how civilizations developed and declined through cycles, providing wisdom on how to avoid past mistakes and build more enlightened futures. Fourth, and perhaps most important access to records, dissolved illusions of separation by directly showing how all beings were interconnected through webs of shared karmas, revealing that the good of each was intertwined with the good of all. This direct perception of unities completely transformed motivations, moving from selfishness to compassion and from competition to cooperation that were the foundations of truly spiritual civilizations. Steiner concluded conversations by emphasizing that developments in the ability to read Akashic records were not ends in themselves, but were tools to serve evolution. Just as a telescope was a tool for studying stars but did not replace developments in understanding astronomical insights, clairvoyant abilities were tools for studying spiritual dimensions, but did not replace developments of moral and spiritual wisdom that were true targets of human existences. The main knowledge about Akashic records that Steiner revealed through these intimate conversations was not technical about how to access, but was philosophical about the natures of memory, time, and reality. Records were not dead archives of fixed pasts, but were living consciousnesses of beings, witnessing and preserving journeys of evolution, creating narratives with meanings that revealed greater purposes, operating through the apparent chaos of historical events. Understanding this transformed relationships with pasts, present and future, revealing that they were not separate but were aspects of totalities where everything coexisted in the eternal now, that it was an experience of divine consciousness containing all creation in infinite awareness. Participating in this awareness through developments in the ability to read records was participating in self-knowledge of the divine through creations that were eternal processes, never complete but always unfolding into new things that enriched themselves through the accumulated experiences of countless beings, each contributing unique perspectives to totalities that were living cosmoses growing in complexities and beauties, through evolutions that were dances of consciousness, exploring infinite possibilities of existences. Wilhelm's notebook was only discovered in 1956 when his grandson found it among the belongings of his grandfather, who had died decades earlier. Records offered glimpses into personal and conversational aspects of Steiner's teachings that were rarely captured in formal lectures, revealing how he adapted explanations to individual students' levels of understanding using analogies and examples that resonated with specific backgrounds rather than cookie-cutter presentations. They also showed extraordinary patience with questions that could seem naive, always responding with seriousness and depth that honored the sincerity of their searches rather than dismissing them as trivial. This generosity in sharing wisdom reflected Steiner's conviction that spiritual knowledge should not be kept as secrets for elites, but should be made available to all who sincerely seek truths regardless of background or social status. The ultimate revelation preserved in conversations was that Akashic records were not only repositories of information, but were mirrors through which consciousnesses could see their own natures reflected in totalities of journeys through multiple lifetimes, revealing patterns of growth and areas that still required development. To see oneself clearly in records was to see both the glories and shames of choices accumulated over eons, creating powerful motivations for transformations based on visceral understandings rather than abstract ideals. This self-revelation was the supreme gift that records offered to those courageous enough to confront complete truths about themselves without illusion or denial. It was a process of deaths of false egos and births of authentic selves that were eternal spirits temporarily incarnated in mortal forms, exploring densities of matter and journeys of self-discoveries that were also discoveries of the divine, because in depths they were inseparable, revealing fundamental units that were truths awaiting recognition through patient work of spiritual developments that Steiner had dedicated his entire life to facilitating through teachings that connected sciences and spiritualities and syntheses that honored both by offering paths of independent verifications rather than demands of faiths. Blindness that were characteristic of religious dogmas but not of spiritual sciences that anthroposophy aspired to be. Conversations preserved in Wilhelm's notebook remained as testimonies of the pedagogical dimensions of Steiner's works, showing not only what he taught, but how he taught, adapting wisdom to students' understanding capabilities, progressively guiding through levels of complexity, always respecting freedom of questioning and doubts instead of imposing authorities that were temptations for all masters, but that Steiner consciously avoided, recognizing that true spiritual developments came through one's own achievements rather than submissions to authorities. External. Main knowledge about Akashic records that emerged from totalities of conversations was that they were manifestations of divine love, lovingly preserving each step of all beings' journeys, ensuring that nothing was lost, but everything contributed to enriching cosmic experiences that were eternal treasures of creation. This perception transformed records from being objects of intellectual curiosities to they were revelations of a fundamental nature of reality as an expression of loving consciousness that supported everything in being through constant attentions, that were foundations of existences, awaiting recognition when developments reached maturity, allowing conscious participation in works of co-creations that were privileges and responsibilities of incarnated spiritual beings discovering through explorations of records that they were much more than temporary bodies, but were eternal consciousnesses, exploring infinities of possibilities through adventures in materiality that were precious gifts, offering unique opportunities for developments that only densities provided, making incarnations, choices rather than exiles when understood in appropriate contexts of evolutions, serving greater purposes that records revealed to those developing capabilities of readings through dedicated practices. That Steiner had taught offering maps of interior territories awaiting explorations of all courageous to seek truths beyond surfaces where mysteries resided, preserved in cosmic memory that it was love manifesting through careful preservations of all experiences and shared treasures of humanity, awaiting discoveries when preparations allowed access, revealing not only facts, but deep meanings of existences that were much more than accidents, but were intentional unfoldings of plans serving evolutions, of consciousness, in directions of realizations of divine potentials that were destinies and legacies of all beings created in the image reflecting essences in individualized forms that were unique expressions of one, manifesting through diversities in eternal processes of self-knowledge, that Akashic records preserved as sacred memories, witnessing journeys of consciousness through creation, in adventures that never ceased but continued through infinities, always offering new horizons of discoveries, awaiting explorations of all participating in works of progressive transformations that were natures of evolutions, moving in directions of perfections that were asymptotically approximated targets, through the efforts of ages demonstrating that journeys were as precious as destinations, because it was through processes that growths occurred, refining consciousnesses and developing virtues that were imperishable treasures, persisting through transformations into nuclei eternal ones that were true, identities of immortal spirits temporarily inhabiting mortal forms, exploring densities on journeys that records preserved as testimonies of adventures of consciousness and creation. Wilhelm had also recorded in a notebook questions about how Akashic records related to concepts of destiny and free will that were apparently contradictory. If everything was preserved in records, including futures, then free will was an illusion and everything was predetermined. Steiner had responded that the contradiction was only an apparent one resulting from thinking about time in a linear way, when in fact time had much more complex structures and dimensions where records existed. On physical levels, time flowed irreversibly from past to future, creating appearances of determinism where the present was the result of the past and the future was the result of the present. But in etheric and higher dimensions, time had qualities of simultaneity where all possibilities coexisted, and where choices made at any moment affected not only futures, but also pasts, through changes in meanings and contexts. Free will operated not through capacities to arbitrarily choose between disconnected options, but through capacities to create new meanings that transformed relationships between existing events by weaving new narratives that had not previously existed. When a person chose to forgive rather than resent past injustice, they were not merely changing present attitudes, but were transforming the nature of the original event into the context of the totality of the journey, creating new futures that were not possible while resentment persisted. Records preserved all these transformations, showing not linear stories, but complex networks of realized and unrealized possibilities, where each choice opened some paths while closing others. Destiny and freedom were therefore complementary aspects where karmas created tendencies and limitations within which freedoms operated by choosing between available options and mainly creating new options through transformations of consciousness that transcended apparent limitations. Another topic explored in conversations was the relationship between Akashic records and the phenomenon of Deja vu, which was the strange sensation of having experienced something before when you consciously knew it was the first time. Steiner explained that déjà vu occurred when present consciousness resonated with impressions in records of similar events from past lives or sometimes probable futures that the soul had previously explored in states between incarnations when planning the present life. These were moments of leaks between dimensions where the veil that normally separated present consciousness from broader memories became temporarily thin, allowing fleeting glimpses of continuities that normally remained hidden. They were not signs of neurological problems as materialistic medicine assumed, but were signs of heightened sensitivities to subtle dimensions that could be cultivated through spiritual practices, developing capabilities to access records more fully and controllably rather than just accidental glimpses. Wilhelm had also asked about differences between Akashic records and concepts of the collective unconscious that psychologists like Jung were beginning to explore. Steiner appreciated the issue by recognizing that Jung was discovering through psychological methods realities that esoteric traditions had known through clairvoyant methods. Collective unconscious was in essence records in astral dimensions, where archetypes and psychological patterns of entire humanity were preserved and shared. But Akashic records were vaster, including not only psychological contents, but real physical events, and mainly causal and spiritual dimensions that psychology did not recognize. Jung was discovering outer layers of multidimensional realities that esoteric traditions explored at much greater depths. Eventually, psychological and spiritual sciences would converge when scientists developed capabilities for direct perception of subtle dimensions, instead of just inferring existences through analysis of dreams and behaviors. Conversations also addressed ethical questions about appropriate uses of knowledge obtained through records. If a person accessed records and discovered that a friend had committed a crime in a past life, should they confront or remain silent? Steiner was emphatic that knowledge of others' karmas should never be revealed without permission because it would violate the sacredness of individual journeys, and because it would typically cause more harm than good by creating blame or denial rather than genuine understanding. In the end, certain connections don't happen by chance. If this made sense to you, maybe it's time to dig a little deeper. The next step is in the description link or pinned comment. Each person had the right to discover their own past at their own pace when they were ready to process information without being overwhelmed. The only exception would be if knowledge was essential to prevent imminent harm to others, but even then, it should be done with extreme care and sensitivity. Generally, wisdom was shared indirectly through advice and guidance that helped people learn lessons without the need for traumatic revelations of specific karmic details. Wilhelm had also recorded conversations about relationships between Akashic records and channeling phenomena, where people claimed to receive messages from spiritual beings or future selves. Steiner had warned that most channelings were mixtures of channelers' imaginations with fragments of genuine perceptions, making it difficult to separate truths from distortions. The problem was that many channelers did not develop the insights necessary to distinguish between their own fantasies versus genuine communications from spiritual beings. Even worse, some consciously or unconsciously allowed Ahrimanic or Luciferic entities to present themselves as ascended masters or benevolent extraterrestrials, when in fact they were forces serving involutions rather than evolutions.